it short, it really is. We've skipped all kinds of details and things over the centuries. Yes, ma'am? Let's pray the Lord keep it that way. All right, there's the guys we talked about last week. Nicholas the first pope to wear a crown. And there he is in his crown, except that's Leo on the left. And that's the present pope on the right. They look like royalty, don't they? Well, they are. They're kings over kingdoms. The Vatican is a kingdom. It's recognized as a political state, even though it's a church. I'm talking about separation of church and state. We have an ambassador to the Vatican. Where's the separation at? I mean, an ambassador to a church. But anyway, they wear those crowns, and we looked at their coats of arms. Some of them last week. Each pope has his own coat of arms, and everything on it is significant. We discussed those two last time. But now we'll move on. Yeah, the keys that the Lord gave to Peter. That's what they're supposed to represent. The Lord said He gave him the keys, and what He binds on earth is bound in heaven, and so on and so forth. Of course, I take that out of context. The Pope can't bind it. Oh, sure. Okay, we'll look on a little bit. Now, the period from 867 to 1049 has been called the darkest period of the papacy. They look at it that way. It's called the midnight of the Dark Ages, which it is, right in the middle of the Dark Ages. But it was full of bribery and corruption and immorality and bloodshed in the professing church. Now, keep in mind the professing church is Catholicism during the Middle Ages, and Bible-believing Christians are tormented and persecuted and burned at the stake and all these kind of things. Their Bibles taken away and so forth. And so everybody who wants to do right basically winds up in the underground church in Europe, throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. Now, the next pope I want to mention to you is Pope John VIII, who was really Joan, 872 to 882. Joan, that's a picture of her as the mother of harlots in Revelation 17, picture from the 15th century. This woman was an English woman, born of English parents. She was born in Germany. She fell in love with a Benedictine monk, and of course the monks were celibates, they couldn't be married and so forth. And so to cover up their little affair, she dressed as a man. And the two of them ran away. They went to Turkey, and he died while he was in Turkey. She continued to dress as a man. Everybody thought that's what she was. And she got into the priesthood and rose rapidly in the church and finally became Pope. And was dubbed Pope John VIII. And she was with child, but nobody knew it. And she, in a papal, one of their pomp and circumstance affairs they had going on, all the hoopah with the Catholic Church and a big deal going on. She went into labor prematurely. And that's when they found out Pope John is really Pope John. And they try to cover that up. If you look at a list of the popes, you'll see Pope John the Eighth. Pope Joan is in the encyclopedia. She's talked about in history books. The Protestants talk about her. Catholics try to sweep it under the rug. That's a picture that's in the National Gallery in Washington. Her Highness the Popess. And that picture was done in the 15th century. And I don't know if you realize or not, but that's on a tarot card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tarot cards have to do with witchcraft. So anyway, that's Pope Joan, the only female pope that's ever existed, and nobody knew she was a female at first. 904 to 963 is called the Rule of the Harlots, and you'll see why in just a moment. The Pope Sergius III, 904 to 911, he had three mistresses, Marosia's sister, and their mother Theodora. They and this Pope had several illegitimate children. And then comes John X. He was made Pope by Theodora, and Marozia became his mistress, and she murdered him. She smothered him to death. Isn't that wonderful that all that going on in a church? And then she proceeded to set up the next three popes herself, and that's why it's called the rule of the harlots. Yes, sir.
The mother set him up as pope?
Yeah, yeah.
What gave her that authority? I thought that was done by voting and all that.
Well, it was supposed to be, but that's why it's called the rule of the harlots. These mistresses took over the papacy and ran the show for the next 40 years or so. She set up the next three popes in succession, and that was Leo VI and Stephen VII, and then her illegitimate Leo, Stephen, her own illegitimate son, John the 11th. She made him pope, and then another one of her sons appointed the next four popes, following John the 11th there. John the 12th, who came later on, was Marosia's grandson, and he was called the Antichrist sitting in the temple of God by the Bishop of Orleans. The bishop thought this guy got no business being pope, and referred to him as the Antichrist. He referred to him and a couple other popes as Antichrist. It's interesting that happened several times. Now, keep in mind we're talking about the Vicar of Christ. Okay, we're talking about God's representative on the earth. We're talking about the guy who's supposed to be infallible.
Yes.
And some of his own followers are labeling him the Antichrist and so forth. And so things just were really, really bad in the Dark Ages for the Catholic Church. They got really bad in the middle of the Dark Ages. And as I said, it's called the darkest time of the Dark Ages by them. Then came Boniface VII. Benedict, okay, let me talk about him for just, well, Boniface, let me back up, I didn't know I had him on there yet. He murdered John the 14th. So here's one guy wanting to be Pope, murdering the Pope so he can be the Pope. Yes, who had Anna.
Did they deal with it like kings do when they had these insurrections between each other? They just murder the other one, kind of like in King's Lines, where they would just King's Line they would just murder everyone else.
Yeah, it's done like
the throne,
like a kingship. They want the throne.
Sure.
You know, all that went on during the Middle Ages. This bishop that had referred to John as the Antichrist, he called Boniface the same thing, and he said this, quote, "They're monsters of guilt, reeking in blood and filth, Antichrist sitting in the temple of God," end of quote. That's what the bishop said about these guys. Let's see, who else we got there? Benedict. He bought the office of Pope through bribery, and that's called simony. Simony is buying a church office, and it's named after Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8, who tried to buy the gift of the Holy Ghost. So that word, you'll find that in the dictionary, simony, the definition is purchasing an ecclesiastical office. And a lot of that has gone on with the popes. They buy the office, just like a lot of representatives buy their seat in Congress and things like that. You don't think they do that kind of stuff. They spread the money around, get the votes, and all that kind of business. Okay, and then comes Benedict the VIII. That's not, I already put him up there, didn't I? Okay, Benedict, we just talked about him, simony, and buying the office and all that. And then John the 19th, he bought the papacy too. And he passed they got this clerical degrees they had to go through before they be Pope. He passed all the tests in one day and was made the Pope. And so it was kind of a shotgun deal with him. Benedict the IX, he became the Pope at 12 years old. Now can you imagine a leader of a worldwide church, 12 years old? But then there are kings, 8, 10, 12 years old, right? We're dealing with the kingship here. And the papal seat got purchased by him with some influential families there in Rome, some wealthy people. He's been called the worst of all the popes, and here's what one history book says about him, quote, says he committed murders and adulteries in broad daylight and robbed pilgrims on the graves of martyrs, end of quote. And he finally got driven out of Rome himself by the people because of his corruption. Now, when he was driven from Rome, that took place in 1044, they made Sylvester III the Pope, and then Benedict returned to Rome, and he sold the papal seat that he didn't have anymore. He sold it to Gregory VI for 1,000 pieces of silver, and then he refused to abide by the sale. So you had 3 popes at one time in Rome. All of them claiming to be the vicar of Christ, all of them claiming to be God's anointed and all that. They were at warfare with each other. None of them, the 3 were strong enough to overthrow the other 2. So 3 popes ruling at one time. Let's see, who we got next? No rule. Chaos. Gregory VI, he had 2 rival popes himself. He's one of those 3 with Benedict, Sylvester, 3 at the same time, each one trying to assassinate the other. Nobody gets anywhere. And then comes Clement II. Clement was appointed by the Emperor of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III of Germany. And Henry said he appointed him, he said, quote, because no Roman clergyman could be found who was free of the pollution of simony and fornication, end quote. You couldn't find any bishop that wasn't wicked. And so he appointed this guy himself. Now, the significant thing about that is, if you remember 300 or 400 years before that, we had popes appointing kings throughout Europe. Now the king's appointing the pope. So before the pope was running the state and saying who sits on the throne, and now the king's running everything and saying who sits in the Vatican there and runs the church. And by this time there was all kinds of uproar throughout Europe for reform in the church, and people who wanted to live right, wanted to do right, they wanted to get rid of all this stuff. And a man named Hildebrand came to the forefront. He was a bishop, and he kind of led the battle for reform throughout the church. And in process, he controlled the next 5 popes from 1049 to 1073, and finally became Pope Gregory VII himself. Now, he was good in the sense that he tried to bring reform and get rid of the immorality and all that stuff that was going on in the church. But he came up with some things that were not so good. He's the one who invented the interdict. We talked about that last week. And that was the Pope's ability to excommunicate an entire nation and consign them all to hell if the king, the ruler, would not bow down to him. He invented the excommunication that if you don't stay a member of the Catholic Church, and you don't do according to the laws of the church and that kind of stuff, you get put out of the church, and when you get put out, you've lost your salvation, and you're going to wind up going to hell if you don't get not able to get back into the church. So he invented all those kind of things. Celibacy, he started that. Priests can't marry, which if you, boy, that's a keg of worms. That just increased more immorality among them, and still going on today. And so he tried to bring reform, but just didn't bring much of anything. Innocent II, several of these guys named Innocent. And the ones named Innocent sometimes turn out to be the worst of all of them. He had a rival pope, and he maintained his authority by armed force against the other guy. So you got kind of a civil war going on between those claiming to be the leaders. A man named Adrian, he was the only English pope, 1154 to 1159. He gave Ireland to England. What's the result of that? The war's still going on in Ireland. The war between the Protestants and Catholics started back here when Pope Adrian gave Ireland over to England and gave the King of England the right to go in and take it by force and conquer the land of Ireland for Catholicism. That was the purpose of all that business. And Pope Alexander III, who came after Adrian, he renewed that commission as a king, so it was carried out in 1171. The armies of England invaded Ireland, and as I said, the warfare is still going on, all that stuff over there in Dublin and so forth, where they once while you're done blowing people up, killing people. That's a Protestant Catholic war. That's what that is. And it's been going on ever since the Pope decided Ireland should be given to England, because Protestants were in Ireland and he didn't want that anywhere. So who are we talking about now? Adrian, okay. And then Alexander III showed up. He had 4 rival popes, so he got 5 of them going on at one time there. These vicars of Christ, man, somebody doesn't know what's going on. And he was not only at war with 4 rival popes, he was at war with the German emperor. So this guy had his hands full of a lot of bloodshed and battles going on there. And finally, he got driven from Rome by the people he died in exile. Innocent III, another one of those innocent guys. We talked about him before. He's the one that forced the King of England to sign the Magna Carta. Remember, King John wanted to set up his own Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Pope got mad at him about that and had the Catholic bishops in England rise up against John and force him to do the Magna Carta, which has some very good points, and some of our constitutions are based on it, yes.
Where is that Magna Carta again?
The Magna Carta was in 1216. It was a document of laws that the king was forced to sign and put into law, and mainly leaned toward leniency for the Catholic Church in England, but like I said, there are some good points dealing with taxation and things like that in the Magna Carta. So that was Innocent III that brought that thing about. But he did something far worse than that. He instituted the Inquisition against the Albigenses. The Albigenses were the Bible-believing Christians in France and northern Italy, and he ordered their extermination, and pretty well accomplished that. Killed all those Bible-believing Christians, tried to get rid of them. I used the word Protestant before, but there was no Protestantism back in that time frame. That came later on with the Reformation. But same kind of deal. People who didn't like the way the church was being run, didn't like all the wickedness going on, and pulled out and tried to live by the Bible and so forth as much as they could. And then they were hunted down and killed and slaughtered and so forth. Thousands of them were sold off into slavery. These Albigenses, thousands more were killed. And the only other degree of bloodshed that the Catholic Church has ever engineered, even close to that, was the attempt to stamp out the Reformation in the 15th and 16th centuries. And that's when so many people were burned at the stake and those kind of things. We got another Innocent IV. He is the one who instituted torture in the Inquisition. Before then, they would arrest people, they put them in jail, stuff like that, if they thought they were heretics. But then they began to torture people to get confessions out of them. And if you don't know about what kind of things were done, I suggest you read Fox's book of Martyrs. Fox was contemporary with these things. He was in the 16th century, and he wrote hundreds of cases of people being arrested, tortured, burned at the stake, all that kind of. And some of their tortures were hideous, absolutely hideous, that a person professing to be a representative of God could even do to somebody else. But a lot of that stuff went on during that time frame, and all that torture and things like that. And really, it's just like the IRS or human resources and all that stuff in our country. You can report somebody and remain anonymous. You do realize that, don't you?
Yes.
And that's the way the Inquisition was. A person reported their neighbor, said, I think, John over there is a heretic. Well, he'd be brought into court and be tortured to get a confession. Now, you torture somebody long enough, they're going to confess to anything.
Yes.
And torture them, and then murder them, put them to death. And never tell them who their accuser was, or even a lot of times what they were accused of. And so it was, they were building a system of what? Fear. Catholicism is based totally on fear. You fear if you don't do right, you're going to get excommunicated. You won't be tortured today, at least not in our country. You would in some places. But you're going to be excommunicated, and thereby you'll be headed for hell. So it's a system of fear.
I like the protection, right?
It is. It's gangsterism. That's all it is. Sure. Al Capone was a good son of the church. He gave $100,000 a year to his cathedral in Chicago. Good boy. Adolf Hitler grew up as an altar boy. You don't have to believe a whole lot to be a Catholic. Just do what you're told. You'll be all right. Let's see. Boniface the Eighth, he made this statement, that if you're not subject to the Roman pontiff, and that's the Pope, then you are definitely going to hell. There's no two ways about it. He said, quote, "We declare, define, establish, and decree that every human creature under the rigid necessity of saving his soul must be subject to the Roman pontiff." I'll have to stand and say on the basis of that, my soul's not saved because I'm not subject to him and not going to be subject to him. And thank God I don't have to depend on that for soul salvation. Especially in view of the fact of the way his predecessors were. I mean, why would you want to be subject to an immoral, murdering character for the saving of your soul? He made him save his own soul, much less anybody else's.
They hadn't even decided who the real pope was sometimes.
Sometimes, that's right. Yeah. Dante, how many of you know who that is? Dante's Inferno, Dante's Divine Comedy and all that stuff. Dante was contemporary with Boniface, and he said the Vatican under the rule of Boniface was a sewer of corruption. And in his Inferno, his allegory of hell, he's got 9 levels of hell. He's got named who's in each level, you know, adulterers, thieves, this and that, all the way down. He assigned Boniface to the lowest hell. He didn't think much of him at all. Probably a lot of truth to it, too. The papacy reached its height under Boniface's rule, and it became victorious over their warfare with the German emperors. The Holy Roman emperors have been going on for about 200 years, and they finally, the church finally won out over that. And Boniface tried to force an end to the 100 Years' War that had been going on between France and Spain. And he threatened interdict on those 2 countries if they didn't make peace. Both of those are Catholic countries, by the way. And he threatened that. He told them that what had happened is in England, in France, the king had stopped sending, the church levied taxes on the nations around there, okay? And it had stopped sending money back to the Vatican. And so the Pope told him that they'd have to do that. Well, he said he wasn't going to do that, and he had his government, and King Edward in England, the same thing, was told the same thing, and had Parliament vote the taxes in for the state and not send them to the church anymore. Yes, sir.
Kind of sounds like a spiritual mafia.
That's what Brother Apple said. Well, that's exactly what it is. They're gangsters, man. They're gangsters. That's all they are. Anyway, these kings quit sending their revenues to the Vatican, and so the Pope, in order to regain favor with the kings, now he's cowed down now, okay, his money supply's been cut off. So he's cowed down a little bit. So what he did to try to get King Philip of France's favor again, he canonized King Philip's grandfather. You understand, canonization in Roman Catholic terms means making a dead person a saint. Okay, get them out of purgatory, making them a saint, and all that kind of stuff. And so he thought he gained favor with Philip by doing that, but apparently Philip wasn't too concerned about his dead grandpa. He didn't care one way or the other about that. He kept the money cut off from the Vatican. And so when Boniface failed in that, he issued in 1302 what he called his Unum Sanctum. That's his #1 writing of holiness, Unum Sanctum. And in that he excommunicated Philip, and he placed France under interdict. And so Philip had the Pope seized and put in prison. And that began French control of the papacy. France took over the Roman Catholic Church and started having their own popes and not allowing them to be in Rome anymore. Well, I didn't tell you that. Okay, we'll get to that in just a few minutes when we talk about these things a little bit more. Well, go to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3. 3, verse 1. Unto the angel of the church in Sardis write, These things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die. For I have not found thy works perfect before God. Remember therefore how thou hast received and heard, and hold fast, and repent. If therefore thou shalt not watch, I will come on thee as a thief, and thou shalt not know what hour I will come upon thee. Thou hast a few names, even in Sardis, which have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Sardis is the Reformation church. Time of the Reformation is when Protestantism was born. They have a name that they're alive, which Protestantism does, but he says it's dead. This began about 1200, had its peak around 1600 with the Reformation, and of course Protestantism is still around, but that's when all that came about. They had a name, they're alive, but they were dead. They had a reputation without life, and of course their future was behind them. Protestantism is going breakneck speed right now, back to Rome as hard as they can, and the reason is they never fully broke from Rome. The reformers all brought part of Catholicism out with them. That's why all Protestant churches have elements of Catholicism in them. And just for the record, Baptists are not Protestants, never have been, never did protest the Church of Rome. We go all the way back to those other groups we talked about, the Waldenses, the Paulicians, the Anabaptists, and all that, way back before there was any Protestant movement at all. Now, what brought it on was this uprising for reform in the church. It's been going on a couple hundred years. People have been getting disgruntled with all the corruption that was in the papacy and all that kind of thing, and all the taxation, heavy taxes on all the nations and all the people, clergy, and moral sale of indulgences. And let me ask you what that is. We talked about that. Indulgence, what is it? Yeah, it's pay down sin later. It's a license of sin later on, but you pay money in order to do that. You pay for a forgiveness down the road somewhere. And they were tired, especially the monarchies were tired of papal interference with the kingdoms and with the state affairs and all that kind of stuff, and all the rival popes, and all that showed that the church needed a great deal of reform. And one of the things that helped, one of the big factors that helped the coming Reformation was partly from the Crusades. The popes ordered the Crusades in 1100. There was eight major crusades. All of those were attempts to get the Holy Land out of the hand of the Ottoman Turks. And the Pope promised the Crusaders eternal life if they would go on the crusade and go and fight the Turks and all that kind of business and regain Jerusalem for the papacy. Yes. Who he was? He was running Europe. They were they were fearful Catholics like everybody else. If I don't do what the Pope says, he's going to excommunicate me. And he did a lot of those kings. We talked about King Henry last week, that he made him kneel barefoot in the snow for 3 days begging penance from the Pope. So he lifted the interdict off of England.
Verse 10.
Yes, sir.
Is this after now that the king of the guy in France has decided who the Pope is going to be? Did this take place before or after that period of time?
Well, that's what kicked this period of time off. We're going to talk about that king a little bit more in a minute if we have time. But anyway, that was the Crusades. The Crusades brought on a movement. It brought on a movement called the Renaissance. And y'all familiar with that. Renaissance is not a religious movement. The Reformation was a religious movement. They were hand in hand going on at the same time. And what brought that on, Europe was basically isolated from the rest of the world. And when the Crusaders went into the Middle East to regain the Holy Land, those people from England and France and Spain and Germany and all that participated in the Crusades, they saw things there that was not going on in their country. There was no art, there was no science, there was no medical advancement, there was nothing going on in the Middle Ages during Europe. There was a time of darkness. Nothing good was happening. And they got over there and they saw art, they saw science, they saw ancient documents they'd never heard of and things like that. And so coming back and telling about all those kind of things, who is it, Marco Polo in the 1500s, went over to China and brought back all the evidence there. Well, these crusaders brought back all this evidence, said, hey, we're missing out on some things. There's things going on in the Middle East we don't know anything about. And so it brought a revival of learning, which is what the Renaissance is about, a revival of learning. And that's why in the 1600s you have some of the so-called greatest artists that the world has ever produced, and the greatest scientists, Galileo and Newton and all those guys, a revival of learning. And it also caused a desire to read the ancient manuscripts. So there was a revival in learning the languages of the Bible that had been kept from the people by the papacy all those centuries. And they began to do translations of the Bible in the 1600s and things like that, and begin to see the Bible says something that the Pope contradicted what the Pope said. So people began to wake up that the papacy was leading folks astray, and thus you had the rise of the Reformation. And the stronger leaders became the reformers, like Knox and Luther and Calvin and all those guys. And it's because they began to see things that had been held from them through the Middle Ages by the Roman Catholic Church. And so that's one of the Renaissances going right along in with the Reformation. Renaissance is the secular thing, and the Reformation is the religious thing going on there. So people got really interested in art and literature and history and all those kind of things. Science, geography. The printing press was invented during this period, early 1400s. Gutenberg invented the printing press, which made the Bible available at much less cost to the common. You can imagine paying a scribe to write this down letter by letter, all the way through the Bible, 800 and some thousand letters, and make sure you get it right and all that stuff. And a tremendous cost involved. So very few people have a Bible or a scroll or whatever, except in the hands of the church itself. And so the printing press, first thing it was printed on was Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which is corrupt, of course, but sure. It was the first thing printed on Gutenberg's press, and it made the printing of books and distribution of books much simpler, much more widespread from that point on. And so, and then it brought on a renewed interest in Greek and Hebrew by so-called scholars, and they began to find these old manuscripts over there in the Holy Land and things like that, and comparing the scriptures with the teachings of Rome. Somebody said, quote, the Reformation owed its being to the direct contact of the mind with the scriptures, end quote. You're going to see what God said, and turned away from all the corruption in the church. Reform was also called for by what's called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, 40-year division in the papacy. And this was brought on by the French king whenever he had the Pope arrested and put in prison. Then King Philip had Benedict the 11th put on the papal throne. And, or rather the people did, and he only lived for 9 months after becoming the Pope, and then Philip had Clement V to be the next Pope, and he's the first of several French popes over the next 40 years. And so, and then Clement moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, wherever that is. Some of you people in France probably know. And it stayed there from 1309 to 1377. That's why it's called the Babylonian captivity of the church. That's what Rome refers to it as. Because it was moved from Rome to France and under French popes during that period. Till 1377 when it was moved back. But corruption in the papacy was even worse in France than it was in Rome, if it could be worse. And then you have what's called the papal, well, I don't have that on there. Okay. The papal schism, and Gregory moved it back to Rome in 1377, moved it out of France. And for several years there, 1377 to 1470, there were two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France. So you had a French pope, you had an Italian pope for all those years, and the church split right down the middle because of it. And so, again, you got two vicars of Christ at the same time in two different places, two sets of popes. I know history is boring to somebody, but I'm telling you, you need to know your heritage.
Amen.
Yes, sir.
You need to know why things are the way they are. They
Sure.
just didn't happen.
Yeah.
The forerunners of the Reformation, let's look at them for just a few minutes because that's what Sardis is all about. The Albigenses, we talked about them, they're also called Cathari, which means the purified ones, and the Pope had them exterminated from southern France, northern Spain, northern Italy, and they stood up against immoralities in the priesthood, against the wickedness that was going on. They were against pilgrimages. You had to make a pilgrimage to atone for your sin and stupid stuff like that. They were against the worship of saints and images. They completely opposed Rome. They used the Bible, which individual members of the Catholic Church were not allowed to do, and they wanted moral purity in the church. Innocent III is the one who ordered their extermination, and they virtually exterminated the Albigenses, yes.
Now, this where they realized, up to this time, they didn't have the word of God?
During the Reformation, yeah.
And now they have it, so this is this time,
No. Baptist, we can take our doctrine all the way back to this book, to the apostles. We believe just what the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Bible-believing Christians throughout the centuries, whatever they were called. Yes. Yeah, they were put to death, the Inquisition. Yes, sir.
The Albigenses were Bible believers in France.
Yeah, France and Northern Italy. Yeah.
But all over the country, I guess there was an underground remnant.
Well, God's always had a remnant of true believers, always has. They did through the Old Testament with the Jews, and when most of the country was apostate, has through the New Testament. Yeah, He's always had his remnant.
This is all pretty much looks like kind of a political, social.
Oh, it is. Catholicism is a religio-political system. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. Don't compare them earlier to gangsters. The popes have done just like Hitler did. He ordered the extermination, the genocide of certain people.
Looks like in the Dark Ages they had the people in the dark.
Well, they did.
They did. Then they saw the light, so to speak, when they got to read the Bible and started studying.
If you remember in the 6th century, the 7th century, the Pope took the Bible out of the hands of the people where they had to go to the priest to know what God said. They were not allowed to have Bibles. Why? The Bible exposed him for what he was. Yeah.
It looks like they came back into that later. I know my cousins weren't allowed to read the Bible or certain things like that.
They did. They did. They can read it now. They print the Bible for the people. There's not supposed to use, for example, a King James Bible. The official Catholic Bible in the United States is called the New American Bible. Not the American Standard, no, the New American Bible. And it's virtually the same thing as the Douay-Rheims Bible, which is the official Roman Catholic Bible in English. It's virtually the same thing, but it's written in American English instead of England English. Yes.
So they had the word, true word to start with.
Oh, sure. Sure. Got it away from.
I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well,
Well,
sure.
Showing them up, then that's when they started reading.
Sure. Sure. I mean, if you were hurting people, you wouldn't want them to read a book against you.
That's the same procedure taking place in dictatorships today. If you can keep the people ignorant, you can
That's it.
control them.
Control the masses through ignorance. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And just like the Nazis burned books by the thousands that were against Nazism, the popes have done the same thing through the centuries. Burned books. I told you all last week, the last major book burning took place in the city of Rome in 1921. Thousands of books got burned. And of course, that was under Mussolini's domain. Okay, then following them was a group called the Waldenses. They were organized by a Bible-believing Christian named Peter Waldo. They were in southern France, northern Italy. And they rejected the Mass. They rejected prayers for the dead. They didn't believe in purgatory. They encouraged personal Bible reading so you can get to know God yourself and talk to Him yourself. You don't have to go through the priest. And through the Inquisition, those people were persecuted tremendously and murdered and so forth. But they're the only Protestant group that's still in Italy, the Waldenses. There's still pockets of them in Italy today, leading Protestant body in Italy. Then the one you've heard of, John Wycliffe, 1320, 1384. He was the first man to put the Bible into English. He did not use the Textus Receptus. It wasn't available to him. He used Jerome's Latin Vulgate. But he's the first one. He was a Bible-believing Christian himself. He used what he had and translated it in English for the people. He even opposed the existence of popes. He said there ought not to be popes, anything like that, anybody lording over God's heritage. He was opposed to cardinals and monks, and he was against transubstantiation and auricular confession, which is what? Remember that term, auricular confession? Does everybody sleep in this class?
No.
Auricular confession is confessing your sin in the ear of the priest. Auricular in the ear of the priest, instead of talking to God. They didn't believe in that stuff, and of course no Bible-believing Christian would. Doesn't the Bible say we're priests before God ourselves? We can go to God ourselves and pray for ourselves, and everybody else, intercede for everybody else, without having to go to a priest. As I said, he was the first one to translate the Bible into English. That was in 1382. He organized a group of believers that came to be known. Oh yeah, he's called the Morning Star of the Reformation. He organized a group of believers called Lollards. That's the name that was given to them. And what it was, he trained men in the Bible and encouraged them to go out 2 by 2, just like Jesus did, the 70 there in Matthew, 2 by 2, witnessing for the Lord and preaching the gospel. And so his Lollards got all over England. And of course, the Pope didn't like any of that. He didn't like him preaching the truth to the people and so forth. And so they got persecuted. Wycliffe himself was condemned by the Pope in 1377. But God kind of intervened for him and protected him, and he died natural causes in 1384. However, in 1428, the popes were still so angry at him for his Lollards and his putting the Bible in the name of people. They had his bones dug up and burned.